Okay, for this demonstration we are going to look at the AMP, Aircraft Marine Products crimp tool that is used for PIDG crimps. That is a pre-insulated diamond grip crimp tool. They come in various forms. This is one of the newer models. You will note it has coloured handles. Some of the older versions, like this one here, had separate coloured handles and were a slightly different shape, but essentially they can crimp the same type crimp connectors. The coloured handles themselves, we can see here we have a brown handle and a black handle, relate to the insulation colour on the crimp that we're going to use with this tool. For example, we can see here we have different colours that will relate in terms of the coloured handles. So we've got the brown handle, so we can use this tool to use the brown crimp, or the black handle can be used with this type of crimp. The difference in the colour handles is the brown handle is for a high temp crimp and the black handle is for a standard crimp. Now before we use any of these tools, we must always check the calibration label. The calibration label should be affixed to the tool. If the tool is out of cal, even by a day or so, it should not be used on the aircraft. So we must check the calibration label prior to using the tool. For the purpose of this exercise, we're going to use the brown and black handled PIDG tool. Now, a couple of things we need to note on the tool itself. As well as telling you the manufacturer, the PIDG type, it also gives you an AWG size. The American wire gauge size tells you what size of conductor can be used with this tool. In this case, it is suitable for 22 to 24 AWG. If the cable size is smaller or larger than that, it should not be used with this tool. Other things to note is this 3-position pin here. This allows me to select this tool for use on the same size cables, but may have different levels of insulation thickness. In position 3, where it is at the minute, it can be used with thicker insulation, and I can move it to position 1 if the cable has a thinner insulation. Now, information on which setting to set it on should be detailed within your standard wire and practice manual. However, if you're unsure, we can do a test crimp, which we'll go through in a minute, to see whether the insulation is being supported correctly. As with all crimp tools, they work on a ratchet mechanism. To fully open the tool, you depress the handles and it will open fully. Once you start the crimp tool, it is a ratchet mechanism, and the only way to release it is to fully close the crimp tool itself. So be very careful, make sure the crimp is correctly located before you close the handles completely. Other things we should be checking for prior to use are obviously that there are no missing bolts or connectors. On this side, if we close it up slightly, you'll see there's a little locating device. That locating device allows me to fit the crimp in the tool correctly, so that when the crimp is formed, it is formed in the correct position. Okay, we're now going to start. Prior to use, some of the checks that we may want to do is to check that the insulation pin is in the correct position. Remember, I said earlier, it should provide support on the crimp to the insulation itself. Now, one method they recommend that you test this insulation crimp position is to actually crimp a connector onto a piece of unstripped cable, as we can see here. It's a fairly straightforward method. Open the tool up, and you must have the tool completely open when you insert the actual crimps into the tool. In this case, we're going to use, as we said before, my little black crimp assembly. Now you can see why they call it a pre-insulated diamond grip. the place where the crimp is going to take effect is already insulated. The little lug or eye is going to be connected to some form of terminal block or tag board on the aircraft. Now comes the fiddly bit, actually connecting or fitting the crimp into the tool. The little locator is on a little spring, so that will move up and down. It's not that simple to do, so you just fiddle with it and you place the crimp into the tool itself. When it's in, you can very slowly close the jaws to make sure it's correctly aligned. It should be flush with the front of the tool, and you should be able to check the connector is sitting nicely over the locator at the back of the tool, as shown here. Once I've done that, I can turn the tool over, and again, this time I've taken a piece of unstripped cable and I insert it into the back of the crimp itself. I then proceed to close the crimp up and complete the crimp when the ratchet opens. Now in this case, you can see that the cable has immediately fallen straight out of the crimp tool. That means that the insulation grip or pin is in the wrong position, and therefore I need to move it. Okay, so we can start again from this point. So what we do, we take the insulating pin and move it from position 3, and I would suggest down to position 1. You may find it's a little difficult, but you have to make sure the holes are correctly lined up. And again, you can go through the same process. With an uninsulated piece of cable, we can now attempt to ensure that the crimp is supported by the insulation and not just by the conductor itself. If it was only supported by the conductor itself, there is a chance that any vibration, wear or tear could damage the conductor and it may become more brittle and the crimp would not be secure. So once again, taking your time, a little bit fiddly, put the crimp in the tool, and I do find it easier just to set it and close the jaws very slightly. Again, checking that it is correctly aligned in the tool itself. Once again, we take my piece of uninsulated wire and we crimp onto the tool itself. Now in this position, you can see that the actual insulator has not formed away from the tool itself. What we should do now is just very gently move it 90 degrees in one direction, 90 degrees in the other direction. If the insulation does not pull out the crimp, then that means it is effectively supported within the crimp itself, and that is a good position for me to carry out my proper crimp. So we move this to one side. If you have done this on the aircraft, it is a good advice to do it on an old piece of wire to start with. Otherwise, you may be crimping a non-conductive crimp onto the aircraft. So we move that to one side out of the way. So the next thing we're going to do is strip the cable ready for crimping. I'll move him over here for now. Now, as with the crimp tools, the wire strippers should have a calibration label on them. They should be tested prior to use. And again, if the calibration date is out or has elapsed, then we should not use the wire strippers. The wire strippers you've probably all used come, and we can use a range of different AWG sizes to strip the appropriate cables. This one goes from AWG 26 down to AWG 16, so it's a fairly wide range. Using the tools themselves is pretty straightforward. There's a clamp at the rear in this part which holds the wire steady as we strip it. So as we move the wire down, we can see it will hold the wire and it moves the insulation hopefully away from the conductor itself. As we release the crimp, the clamp should also release, allowing me to remove the cable before the jaws close again. So we'll have a go at this. Now the cable I'm using here is 22 gauge cable, so I fit it into the 22 gauge slot. Closing the clamp, strip the cable, which comes away nicely. The clamp opens and allows me to remove the cable quite easily. One thing to be careful of is you don't attempt to close the clamp too quickly, or don't fully open the jaws. And what can happen then, it's in the right place. Again, to strip it, if I close it too quickly, it can mash or damage the cable itself. So be very careful when you're using it. Now, this is only a test piece, so we don't worry over much of things that went wrong. I shall move that over to the side. So once I've stripped my cable, in this particular case, you put the connector or the crimp onto the strip wire. Now, always, when you're using these, refer to the standard wiring practices manual. It will give you guidelines on how much conductor you should strip back for the particular connector. In this type of crimp, we should always see a little bit of the conductor protruding, as we can see here, from the edge of the crimp. The manual will typically tell you approximately between 1/64th to 1/32nd of an inch. Now that's incredibly difficult to measure, but it's generally accepted. As long as I can see the conductor protruding from the end of the crimp, then that should form a good enough crimp. When you fit the conductor or the crimp onto the conductor, you push it on as far as you can. The insulation will back up against the butt of the crimp and the conductor should poke through. When we've done this, we then move to my crimp tool. Once again, open the jaws, and again, a little bit fiddly. Sometimes it's easier with the wire on, sometimes with the wire off. Fit the crimp into the crimp tool, and again, close the barrel up slightly. Now we've done that, I can look at my stripped wire and push him into the crimp itself. I'll now complete the crimp using the tool appropriately, remove the crimp from the tool and inspect it. And the things I'm looking for here is the fact that I can see the conductor protruding through the barrel, so it's correctly fitted in. And if you have a magnifying glass, you can have a look and there should be a dot code stamped on the back of the crimp. Well, now we've completed the crimp, we can move on and connect them up to the appropriate tag boards. This type of connection is typically used with this sort of terminal block, where it just slides over and there'll be a particular nut assembly that screws down to secure it into place. There are special types of tool to ensure the correct torque. These are little torque spanners known as a Ward-Brook tool. It's a cross between a socket and a screwdriver. If you were to use a straightforward socket, there is a danger you would apply too much torque and you could damage the crimp itself. So that finishes this presentation on the use of our A&P crimp tools.